Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see everybody tonight. Have you ever heard a sermon preached with Barabbas as the main subject of the sermon? Well, possibly, but probably not. I know that I've never preached one before, and I know that I've not ever heard a sermon preached before, but as many of you know, from time to time, I like to preach lessons on subjects that maybe we really don't give that much thought to. Subjects that we can learn from, but maybe ones that we often overlook. You know, Barabbas is viewed, and rightfully so, as a despicable character in the Bible. He was the man that was preferred by the Jews over Jesus when Pilate offered to release one prisoner during the observance of the Passover in John 18, verses 39 and 40. And he certainly does not appear to be one that we would want to look to as an example. He doesn't appear to be one that we can take any instruction from. But even negative examples are ones that we find that can be valuable. Remember, Paul told Timothy that all Scripture is profitable. There's something to be gleaned from all Scripture. So tonight, let's take a look at this man. Let's take a look at his story and see some of the lessons that we can learn from Barabbas. Well, his story really begins with the Jewish leaders. Long story short, they didn't like Jesus. They wanted Jesus dead, but they had a problem. Well, from the outset, we might look at this and they say, well, Jesus was innocent. That's their problem. Well, they had already taken care of that. They had already put their spin on it, and in their form of a trial, they had used false witnesses and false testimony to convict Jesus of things that were not true. But where the problem lay was not among the Jews, but the problem lay with the Romans. The Romans were occupying Jerusalem at the time, and part of the agreement that they had with the Jews was that the Jews were certainly allowed to self-govern their people. They were allowed to punish their people, but they were not allowed to execute someone. They were not allowed to take the life. And so the Jews knew that the only way that they could reach the desired outcome for Jesus that they had was they had to get the Romans involved. Well, you remember Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate, he sees this as a Jewish matter. And he tells the Jews, he says, well, why don't you just handle it yourselves? This seems like a matter that would fall within your realm of judgment. Why don't you just take care of it? Well, in John 18:31, they replied back to Pilate, and they said, because it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. You see, they had no desire to seek any other form of punishment for Jesus than that which they could not lawfully carry out. And so they had to come before the Romans. They had to appeal to Pilate, this Roman governor. He was the only one that could give the authority for Jesus to be put to death. And so the Jews were dependent upon him. They knew they couldn't get the job done without the blessing of Pilate. But Pilate wasn't a pushover. He wasn't an ignorant man. He knew what the Jews were up to. He knew that they had an ulterior motive. He knew that Jesus was an innocent man. But he knew that the Jews were envious of his popularity, were envious of his position and the praise that he was receiving from man. And he really didn't care to be used by them to carry out their desires. But he also had a charge. And the charge that he had been given by Caesar was that he had to keep the peace. And if he was not able to keep the peace in that region, then he would be removed from power. Someone else would be brought in, and the last thing that he wanted was a provoked Jewish leadership stirring up trouble. And so he had a dilemma. But he came up with a plan. And the plan that he devised can be described in one word: Barabbas. The custom of the day was, as a goodwill gesture to the Jews, to release one Jewish prisoner at their annual Passover observance. Now, something to keep in mind: the Jews were not the ones who were allowed to choose who this prisoner was going to be. Pilate, he would choose who this was going to be. He was the one that would make the decision. And as a goodwill gesture, he would allow them to receive one of their prisoners back. But it was never someone that was guilty of a violent crime. It was never someone that was just so blatantly evil that they had been, as we would say today, that they had been sentenced to death. It would be someone that owed some type of a debt, or someone that had been engaged in some lesser crime. Well, here, Pilate decides he's going to give the Jews a choice. Remember, I said, usually he was the one that just picked. But he decides this time, I'm going to give the Jews a choice. Well, he knew that if he just came out and he said, in keeping with this tradition, I'm going to turn Jesus loose. He knew that if he did that it was just going to stir the pot even further. But what he was hoping was that he could find someone so heinous, so hated, so guilty of their crime, that they would have to choose Jesus. Well, there were two things at work here. He presented a choice to the Jews. He said, you can have Jesus or you can have Barabbas. Well, first, Jesus was innocent of all charges. None of the things that the Jews were levying against him were true, and Pilate knew it. He knew that Jesus was an innocent man. John 18:40 tells us, though, that Barabbas, on the other hand, was guilty. But in his examination of Jesus, Pilate took the time to consider the charges. And when he came back to the Jews, he told them, I see no fault in this man. He's done nothing wrong. Luke 23:14 and 15, he says, these things that you say he's done, I see no proof of that. So why do you want to put him to death? What has this man done that is worthy of death? Well, according to John's account in John 18:38, he just came out and he said, I find him not guilty. And most of the time, that would settle the matter. Most of the time in our courts of law today, when the judge says the verdict is not guilty, that's the end of the matter, isn't it? But the Jews weren't going to allow that to happen. In Matthew 27:24, Pilate even goes so far as to refer to Jesus as a just man. He knew Jesus was innocent. Knew that he had done nothing wrong. But then you have Barabbas. Barabbas was as guilty as Jesus was innocent. Pilate knew that as well. John 18:40 says that Barabbas was a robber. But that description does not even begin to describe the full extent of his crimes. In Acts 3 and verse 14, Peter refers to him as a murderer. And he does so with good reason. Mark 15 and verse 7 adds that Barabbas was lying bound in prison and with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. So we see that Barabbas was a part of a group of insurrectionists, rebels against Rome. Those who had risen up and had tried to use physical strength to overthrow Roman occupation. And we see that they were so fanatical in their cause that they had even murdered people. And there are some sources that say that some of these individuals would even be active in political assassination. And if that's the case, Pontius Pilate very well could have had a price on his head by this very man. But also, we see some indications in the text that Barabbas may have even been the leader of this group. Because in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 16, he is referred to as a notable prisoner. Or as one translation terms it, he was a well-known terrorist. That's a term we can identify with today, isn't it? He was a well-known terrorist. Well, more than likely, Barabbas and his little group were a part of a larger Jewish group known as the Zealots. And the Zealots were a political movement that were dedicated to overthrowing the occupation of Rome. They wanted to reclaim the independence of Israel as their own nation. Well, incidentally, on a side note, and this is one that I find very interesting, one of Jesus' apostles, a man by the name of Simon, had formerly been a part of this same group, according to Luke 6:15 and Acts 1 and verse 13. But we find that there's a very powerful lesson that we can take from this. Because another of Jesus' apostles, a man by the name of Matthew, had been a tax collector working for the very government that Simon had been working to overthrow by force. But yet, they had been able to lay their respective lifestyles aside when they came to Christ. Their past was no longer what was leading them. Yes, in the past they had opposing philosophies, but they laid those aside in order to follow Jesus in peace and harmony. And you know, this aspect of Christianity is more than likely what Isaiah was prophesying to in Isaiah 11 and verse 6, where he says, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together." And you remember Paul made the statement in Galatians 3 and verse 28 that we are all one in Christ Jesus. But back to the point that's at hand. Barabbas was guilty without question. He had done what he was convicted of doing. But whenever we consider what Jesus had been accused of, we find that ultimately Barabbas was accused of many of the very same things. And where Jesus was innocent, Barabbas was guilty. In Luke 23 and verse 2, the Jews said that Jesus was perverting the nation, was forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and then in verse 5, was stirring up the people. Well, those are the very things that Barabbas was doing through this insurrection that he was leading. But Pilate knew what he was doing. He had a plan. He would use the Jews' own custom to get himself out of this dilemma. Give him a choice. What prisoner do you want me to release to you this year? Do you want Jesus? This man that I find no fault in? Or do you want this notorious terrorist? This man that has risen up against Rome, that has caused problems for your people? Which one do you want? You know, this really was a good plan, wasn't it? It really was. Like I said, Pilate was not a pushover. He was a very wise leader in many ways. And he surely thought the leaders of the Jews are not going to want this man that can mess up the peace that they currently have with Rome. John 11 and verse 48 said that the Romans could come and take away their power, take away their position, if they rose up against them. And so Pilate is thinking, surely they're not going to want this man that puts everything in jeopardy. Well, ultimately, we see that 37 years later, Rome came and took away their power, took away their nation. Many of them lost their lives. Many others were taken back to Rome as slaves in the destruction of Jerusalem. But if they chose Jesus, then they wouldn't have to worry about this man. If they would choose Jesus, here was a peaceable man. He's not going to cause any problems. But Barabbas, he could cause you to lose everything that you have. Pilate thought, surely they'll choose Jesus and it'll get me out of this problem. It was a great plan. It really was. But there was something that Pilate had not counted on. He had not counted on the insane hatred that the Jewish leaders had toward Jesus. They were past the point of rational thinking. Have you ever had a time where you got so mad that you just couldn't think straight? And you had to stop and calm down? Well, sure. Well, they got so stirred up. They were so angry. Their hatred was so strong against Jesus that they weren't thinking about the ramifications of the decision that was before them. They were running on blind emotion. Hatred. And they didn't even think about it. Immediately, when Pilate presented the options in Matthew 27:21, he said unto them, which of these two will ye that I release unto you? And immediately they said, Barabbas. Well, Pilate's kind of caught off guard. He didn't expect that. I kind of sense that he was rendered speechless. And when he did not automatically respond back to them, they began crying out all together. The whole crowd that was there, crying out, away with this man, away with Jesus, and give us Barabbas. Not this man, not this innocent man, but give us the criminal. Give us Barabbas. Well, Pilate knew that his plan hadn't worked. He didn't have a plan B, and so he gave in. Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas to them. Delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. Mark 15:15. Well, Pilate, he knew that this was a decision he didn't want to make. This was a decision that he would not have made on his own, had it not been for the desire to keep the peace with the Jews. And so, with great ceremony, he has a basin of water brought out and he washes his hand before the Jews and he tells them, he says, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. But in the next statement that he says, he proves his guilt. 4 words, see ye to it. He washes his hands, he says, I'm innocent, and then he says, crucify Jesus. Just because he washed his hands, folks, it didn't change a thing. He was just as guilty as the Jewish leaders. But I don't suppose that there has ever been a greater perversion of justice than in the trials of Jesus. before the high priest, before Herod, before Pilate. It's truly, as we read in Acts 8 in verse 33, his judgment was taken away. But there's a deeper level to this. The Romans had apparently already prepared 3 crosses for that execution day. None of them were intended for Jesus. He was a last-minute, unexpected development that was brought forth at first light. Remember, according to Mark 15 and verse 25, Jesus was nailed to the cross at the 3rd hour. At 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was the practice of the Romans to prepare for the day of execution on the day prior. 3 men were to be crucified on that day. Just like in days gone by, when a gallows would be built the day before someone was to be hung to death. The crosses would be prepared. The holes would be dug. Everything would be prepared so that at first light they could begin the activities of the day. So who were these 3 crosses intended for? I want you to entertain a thought with me. And before we get into this, I want you to know that the scenario that I'm about to share is one that cannot be completely proven from Scripture. But I don't believe that it's too much of a stretch to suppose that these 3 crosses were prepared for Barabbas and his fellow murderous robbers. We know that the 2 men who were crucified on either side of Jesus were described as thieves according to Matthew 27, verse 38. Luke 23:33 calls them malefactors. The Greek word here denotes one who does evil works. But even Matthew's word thieves is a special word in the Greek, because the word in the New Testament that usually describes a thief is the Greek word kleptos. This describes a thief that comes in the night, one that simply comes to steal, but not to do physical harm. This is where our modern day term kleptomaniac comes from. But the difference in this word and in the word that we see used in the Greek to describe these 2 thieves that were crucified on either side of Jesus is this word kleptos would be very similar to what we might refer to as a burglar. Someone that breaks into your home or comes onto your property simply with the intent of stealing from you. But the word that we find used in the Greek in reference to these men would be very similar to what we might refer to today as an armed robber. One who comes with the intent of not only stealing from you, but also bringing physical harm. Another place where this Greek word is used is in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The men that the traveler fell among were armed robbers. They stole from him, they beat him, they left him for dead. Their intention was not just to rob him, but their intention was to cause physical bodily harm as well. These 2 thieves were violent men. These were men who had committed acts of violence. After all, a common thief most of the time would not face crucifixion. A common thief would be forced to pay back what they had stolen. And if they could not pay it back, they were forced to serve time in jail until they either worked that debt off or they could pay it back. Crucifixion was reserved for the most violent of crimes. And if these two men are the them that are mentioned with Barabbas in Mark 15 and verse 7, then it's very likely that the third cross was intended for Barabbas himself. So here's the scenario. Barabbas was a leader in a rebellion against Rome, having committed all types of atrocities, including theft and murder. He had been arrested along with at least two of his henchmen, had been convicted, had been sentenced to die by crucifixion. Rome had designated the day that they were to die, and he was fully convinced when he awoke that morning that that would be his last. But then this episode with Jesus comes up, and it puts a hitch into the plans. With the Jews' choice reluctantly accepted, or with Pilate's choice reluctantly accepted by the Jews, Barabbas is now a free man. A man who had resigned himself to die, who thought that he had mere hours to live. He's now a free man, and his cross is left for Jesus. Now, for just a moment, I want you to put yourself into Barabbas' shoes. You're guilty. You're on Rome's version of death row. You know you're going to be crucified. You know that you have just hours to live. You know that your guilt is real because your partner in crime is going to admit on the cross just a few hours later that we're in this condemnation justly, for we receive the due reward for our deeds. They were guilty. They knew they were guilty. But you were passionate about your cause. You were willing to risk it all to accomplish what you thought was right. But you knew that as soon as you were arrested that it was all over. You knew that you weren't going to be set free. You knew that you were never going to be able to go about your work again. But then you hear, oh, that's right. Every year about this time, Pilate releases a prisoner. Well, surely it's not going to be me. Someone that's done something so violent, someone that has done something so heinous, someone that has just hours to live, surely it's not going to be me. But then you hear it's official. By some streak of luck, the crowd has chosen you. And you're now a free man. You're going free. But then you hear who the other prisoner is. As a Jew, more than likely, you've heard about Jesus. You've heard about some of the things that he's accomplished. Maybe you've even heard that people claim that he's the promised Messiah. And you begin to wonder, why are they releasing a guilty man and putting to death an innocent man? And then you hear the rest of the story. The choice was presented to the people. Barabbas or Jesus. And people chose you over Jesus. But then it begins to sink in even more. Your cross has now become his cross. The death that you were to suffer has now become his. You're going free. But as a direct result, an innocent man is going to die. This is something that's hard to ignore. As a Jewish man acquainted with the Scriptures, you might even think of Isaiah 53 and verse 5. Of the one who was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Interesting food for thought, isn't it? Now let's step back out of Barabbas' shoes. Let's start at another place and work ourselves back to him again. In Leviticus chapter 16, we find the record of ceremonies concerning the Jewish Day of Atonement. And in verses 7 through 10, we find where God told Aaron to take 2 goats. They were to be presented. One was to be a sacrifice. The other was to be set free. Leviticus 14 tells of a similar arrangement related to the cleansing of leprosy. But this time it involved 2 birds, one to be killed, used in ceremonial cleansing, the other to be set free. I don't know about you, but in these arrangements I kind of see a glimpse of the gospel plan. Folks, Jesus died in our place. And we are the ones who are set free from the guilt of sin. Hebrews 9 and verse 12 says, "Not with the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood he entered in once for all into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption." Folks, this is a beautiful picture. One that starts with the ceremonies of the Day of Atonement and in the leprosy cleansing ceremonies. But as 2 old sayings so fitly put it, the Old Testament is the bud, but the New Testament is the blossom. And the Old Testament is the gospel concealed, and the New Testament is the gospel revealed. But now look back at Barabbas for just a moment. There he stands in this place between these 2 great laws. The Old Testament used animals and their physical sacrifice for freedom, or freedom respectively. Here's a man, a descendant of Adam, standing in their place. Now, something to keep in mind. This was not yet the final revealing of the scheme of redemption. That was something that was still to come on the day of Pentecost. We're still talking about physical life and physical death. But what we're seeing here is one more step, one more piece of information. God did not intend to stop with the sacrifice of bulls and goats in the Mosaic system. There was something more to come. But in Barabbas, he was showing symbolically that something greater is coming. Showing what was in store for mankind. Because in the gift of physical life that was being given to Barabbas, to this man who stood condemned, he was foreshadowing the gift of spiritual life that is given to each and every one of us who stood spiritually condemned. So what do we learn from this? Well, step back into Barabbas' shoes one more time. And I want something to sink in. I am Barabbas. You are Barabbas. Our path follows his exactly. Barabbas is a perfect parallel in the physical world to our salvation in the spiritual world. I want you to think about some parallels with me for just a moment. Like him, we were guilty and we knew it. We were condemned by our own heart, according to 1 John 3 and verse 20. Like him, we were without hope. We were facing certain death, but it's something that most people avoid thinking about. Like him, we learned about the judge accepting somebody else. somebody in our stead to bear the punishment that was destined for us. We learned about His innocence. But we learned that by Him taking our place, He paid the price for us. Paid the penalty. He didn't deserve that sentence of death. We did. Like Him, though, we took that opportunity. You know, Barabbas, he could have stood up and said, "No, I'm guilty. I'm going to stay in this innocent state. He's an innocent man. You let him go." No. Like Barabbas, we took the opportunity to avoid condemnation. When we became children of God, whether we fully understood all of the why or not, we allowed Jesus to be the atonement for our sins. And surely, like Barabbas, we feel immeasurable gratitude for what has been done for us, for the life that has been given to us. But then there's a question that often arises. Did Barabbas leave that prison cell a changed man? Well, there's no way of knowing, because he's never mentioned again. But what we do know is that one of the thieves on the cross did become a changed man. While on the cross, he recognized his sinful state. He recognized who Jesus was. And so there is a distinct possibility that Barabbas may have changed his life. But we don't know that. But what we do know is this. Every person today that is freed by Jesus' death, meaning we have obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ in fulfillment of His plan of salvation, then that death makes us a changed person. Like we talked about in our lesson this morning, we're to become transformed, a new creature. In fact, the very word convert has that meaning. To change, to transform, to turn. You know, it's a pleasant thought that just perhaps Barabbas at some point in his life may have changed. We don't know that. But surely one of the joys of heaven will be to find out. To learn the answer to such things. But the question that we need to ask ourselves tonight is this. Have we accepted the death of Christ? Jesus came, He lived His life, and He died on the cross to make possible for us our salvation. But have you allowed Him to be your Savior by obeying the gospel? Have you placed your faith in Him and repented of your sins? If so, if you've not confessed Him and been baptized for the remission of your sins, take that action tonight. Become a child of God. Jesus paid the price for you so that you would not have to. But the way that we gain access to that free gift is by doing what Jesus has commanded, by obeying the gospel. And it may be that there is someone here who is a child of God, but you've strayed from the faith. And possibly something has been said tonight that's caused you to realize something in your life that is amiss. If so, come forward and make that known. Let us go to the Father in prayer on your behalf. Tonight, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come at this time while together we stand and sing.